A young woman walked out of this department store, got into a rental car, and was never seen again. The signature on the rental car agreement was a forgery. Forensic scientists hoped that either the handwriting or the ink from the pen would solve the mystery. Nestled in the hills 60 miles northwest of Los Angeles lies Ventura, California. May 6, 1996 started like most other days for 30-year-old Sherry Daly as she dropped her 2 children off at school. But on this morning, she went shopping before work. Sherry was expected home by noon, but she never returned.
911 dispatch.
My wife brought my boy off over 8:30 this morning, and she's been missing since. What is her first name? Sherry Daly.
Sherry's van was found in the parking lot of a local store. It was unlocked, with her purse and items from the store still inside.
At this point, we're still trying to figure out where'd she go, thinking that she might be with a relative, or she might have gone off with some friends for some reason. We didn't know.
Detectives asked the store employees if they had seen anything suspicious. A security guard recalled seeing Sherry in the store earlier that morning.
She stopped and spoke briefly with a friend of hers who was head of security of the department store at that time. And then she went about her business and did some shopping, checked out. She walked out of the department store and walked over towards her van.
The surveillance camera shows that Sherry left the store at 9:22 a.m.
I mean, Sherry's the backbone of our family, and now she's missing.
Today we're going to try and do the base of Ventura, river bottom.
Friends and family passed out flyers throughout the community. Television and radio reports asked citizens for information.
One volunteer says today reminds him of the day they found another Ventura County missing woman.
Many knew Sherry Daly and her husband Michael since they both grew up in the area.
He was the first real boyfriend she ever had. She was just so much in love with him that she could see nothing else. I mean, the sun rose and set in Mike.
Sherry and Mike had been married for 12 years and had 2 small children. Mike worked as a manager at a grocery store. A background check revealed the couple had a history of marital problems.
We know that he represented to her that he wanted to make a go of the marriage, but his actions did not coincide with his expressed reason for going back to the home.
Why? Friends said Michael had a lover, a woman he worked with who was a former model, Diana Hahn.
He did not keep it a secret. His co-workers knew about it, family members knew about it, and of course Sherry Daly actually learned about it as well.
The day after Sherry's disappearance, investigators decided to question Diana Hahn at her home.
She answered the door in a skimpy outfit, obviously been in bed, and behind her was Michael Daly, just wearing a pair of shorts.
Naturally, police were suspicious.
I wouldn't expect a concerned husband to be at his girlfriend's house while his wife is gone, has disappeared.
Soon, a witness came forward claiming to have seen Sherry Daly in the parking lot and said she appeared to be in some distress. Just a few days after 30-year-old Sherry Daly disappeared, an eyewitness told police she saw Sherry in the store parking lot, and it looked as if she was being arrested.
She was seen by eyewitnesses standing at her van door, opening it, and a woman approached her. Sherry turned around, spoke with her briefly, just exchanged some words, very briefly. Whereupon Sherry turned around. The woman placed handcuffs on Sherry, walked her over to the car, put her into the back of the car as a police officer would,
The person was described as female, wearing a tan pantsuit, blonde hair, and sunglasses.
This didn't resemble Diana Hahn, who was Michael Daly's lover. Hahn was a brunette, and she didn't own a car like the getaway vehicle.
The description was a teal-colored car. That, to me, wasn't a common car color to be seen on the road. So my attitude was, it's got to be a rental.
Detective Burt and his partner visited all of the local car rental agencies in the area.
Skip was asking the lady behind the counter, did Michael Daly rent a car from you folks? And so she gets on the computer and nothing comes up for Michael Daly. And he asks, well, what about a Diana Hahn? And lady goes to the computer and lo and behold, she says, yeah, Diana Hahn rented a car on the 5th, May 5th.
May 5th was the day before Sherry disappeared.
We looked at each other and it was like, ooh.
Diana Hahn denied renting the car, claiming the signature on the rental agreement wasn't hers. Furthermore, no one at the car agency could positively identify Hahn as the person who rented the car. The rental car had recently been returned.
We looked in, you could just look inside the back windows and you could see on the rear floorboard a brownish color in the carpeting.
Forensic scientists performed tests on those brownish stains in the back seat. A phenolphthalein test was positive. It's a chemical reagent that turns red when it comes into contact with the hemoglobin content of blood.
It appeared as though this was an area in which blood had pooled or puddled. An individual sitting in the passenger back seat had been leaning forward and bleeding, producing blood running and dripping into this area on the floor.
Investigators then used luminol to look for blood that may have been cleaned from the car and trunk.
What we were told by the crime lab is that when they luminoled the inside of that car, it lit up like a candle. I mean, there was blood everywhere, on the door panels, up in the headliner, everywhere.
With blood samples from Sherry's parents, forensic scientists concluded that the blood inside the rental car was that of Sherry Daly.
I knew something seriously was wrong because I knew she would never leave her children. I mean, she would never, ever have left her children on her own free will.
And scientists found something else. In the back seat of the car were 5 long pieces of what looked like human hair.
When I examined them microscopically, I found that they weren't hairs at all.
There were unusual arrowhead-shaped designs on the shafts. An infrared spectrometer identified the molecular structure of the strand not as a hair, but a fiber, the type used to make wigs. Was it possible that the woman who abducted Sherry Daly was either in disguise or wasn't a woman at all? 25 days after Sherry Daly's disappearance from a store parking lot, search volunteers found some bones off of a remote road just 3 miles from where Sherry was abducted.
They called about 5:30 that Saturday evening. I want to tell you before it hits the 6 o'clock news, because it's going to hit the news, that we have found the remains of a woman. And he said Kristen was Sherry's friend. Kristen has positively identified the clothes as being Sherry's.
Sherry Daly's dental records were already on hand for identification purposes.
The correlation between the dental x-rays, I felt at the time, sufficient enough to tell the investigators that even without me taking x-rays of the human remains, that the remains were of Sherry Daly.
And forensic scientists were also able to determine the cause of death.
Forensics experts at the crime lab were able to map out the different stab wounds, the different tears in Sherry's shirt, indicating that there were multiple stab wounds, more in fact than were located in the bones.
Sherry suffered a devastating attack.
There was in the right jaw area a piece of metal that was embedded in the bone that was removed by one of the forensics experts at our crime lab, Jim Roberts.
Roberts analyzed the metal fragment using an electron microscope, which produced a three-dimensional image and a picture he could identify.
After some study on the microscopes, we became convinced that it was part of a serrated knife blade, actually the tip of one of the teeth of the serrations.
Sherry's husband, Michael, was one of the two suspects in the murder. He said he was at work at the time of her abduction.
Everything pointed to Diana, and we knew Mike was at work, so he has the alibi of not being the hatchet man.
Michael's mistress, Diana Hahn, was the other suspect. The car used in Sherry Daly's abduction was rented by someone who signed Diana Hahn's name. Hahn denied it was her signature and insisted someone else had rented the car and forged her name. Jack Harris is a forensic document examiner who specializes in handwriting analysis.
So if anyone is going to forge her name, they're going to try to make it look like the signature on the driver's license, and yet this had a very visible difference.
The capital letters on the rental car agreement were noticeably different than Diana Hahn's known signature sample, and the writing also had a different slant.
It's a common way of first step in disguising a signature oftentimes. The question signature on the budget rental agreement had the little letters, and then it went straight out to the right.
Harris then compared the signature on the car rental agreement to signatures Diana Hahn signed 10 years earlier. And in those signatures, Harris found a surprise. Diana Hahn's signatures of a decade earlier were strikingly similar to the signature on the rental car agreement.
Sure enough, every so often she went straight out to the right and didn't curl back again. I concluded that, in my best judgment, she signed the rental agreement and initialed the agreement.
Harris believes that in signing the rental car agreement, Hahn thought she was creating a forgery, but she was unknowingly using her writing style that she had used years earlier. And investigators found more forensic evidence.
A lady that worked at a wig store in Oxnard recognized Diana Hahn as a person who had purchased a wig from her just shortly before Sherry Daly's abduction.
Hahn had paid for the items with a check. Detectives searched Hahn's records and found other checks written shortly before Sherry's disappearance.
The checks were interestingly written in green ink. Not too many people carry a green ink pen in their purse. When Diana Hahn was arrested, she was found in her purse a green ink pen.
Detectives sent the checks and the green pen to a forensic document examiner who specialized in ink analysis.
First tests that I would perform are non-destructive in nature, and they're intended to evaluate the ink formulations, not the pen, but the ink formulations.
The most common technique in ink comparison is to use a video spectral comparator.
What this instrument does is evaluate inks in the ultraviolet, visible, and infrared portion of the spectrum. The theory is if it's the same ink formulation, it should react the same under all conditions examined.
Infrared lighting can identify if two ink samples are the same or different. The spectral comparator showed that the ink on the checks was from the same ink batch as the pen in Diana Hahn's purse. And Diana Hahn's checkbook revealed she had made some other unusual purchases.
Based upon who those checks had been written to, the detectives followed up, went to another department store, and did in fact learn that Diana Hahn had purchased an axe, lighter fluid, matches, sunglasses, various items that would have been used during the abduction.
Diana Hahn was arrested and charged with Sherry Daly's murder. The question now, was Michael Daly involved?
Narcissistic, egotistical, sociopath, total lack of conscience, despicable, disgusting human being.
Witnesses told police they saw a blonde woman abduct Sherry Daly from a department store parking lot. The prime suspect, Diana Hahn, was a brunette. In a search of her home, investigators found evidence that Hahn was a master of disguises.
When we executed a search warrant in her room, we found all kinds of photographs showing her in different get-ups and wigs and makeup as she posed for its modeling agency. We asked Diana Hahn's mother if she could pick out her daughter in any of these photographs, and her mother started shaking her head no, that this wasn't her daughter.
And Hahn's telephone record showed something curious. Diana and Michael spoke by telephone numerous times immediately before and after the abduction. Based on the telephone calls and the forensic evidence, prosecutors say Diana Hahn rented the car under her own name because rental agencies When Sherry left the store, Hahn may have posed as a member of law enforcement because witnesses say Sherry was handcuffed and placed into the back seat. At some point, Sherry inevitably recognized Diana and knew her husband and his mistress were going to kill her. The forensic evidence shows that Diana killed Sherry in the backseat of the rental car, threw her body down the deserted ravine, put the murder weapons in the trunk, and drove to Ventura Marina. There she changed out of her bloody clothes and called Michael from the payphone to say the murder was done. From there, Hahn drove to a car wash and attempted to clean the blood from the back seat and trunk, but she was unsuccessful. Luminol, phenolphthalein, and DNA testing confirmed that Sherry Daly was brutally attacked in Hahn's rental car. The 5 wig fibers confirmed the disguise. Forensic handwriting and ink analysis also revealed that it was Hahn's signature on checks used to purchase the wig and the axe.
You have to be maniacal, you have to be evil, you have to have something inherently vicious inside of you to be able to do what she did to Sherry Daly and to leave those 2 young boys without their mother.
The telephone calls Hahn placed to Michael Daly before and after the murder was evidence of his complicity.
The night that we arrested Michael, we did a search warrant on his home, and on the bed where he and his wife had slept was a full-length pillow that you can get probably through some company where you can actually take somebody's photograph and have it actually printed on this pillow. Well, guess whose face was on the pillow? Diana Hahn's. And that pillow was there while Sherry was still alive.
I still get hurt for the betrayal. I think he betrayed us, and he betrayed Sherry in the worst possible way. And the fact that she loved him and he used that love.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find Michael Anthony Daly guilty of...
Diana Hahn and Michael Daly were both convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison.
Church life and upbringing tells me that I should be able to forgive him. Unfortunately, God is going to have to forgive me for the fact that I will never be able to offer that forgiveness to him.
Can you describe Sherry and Diana's relationship?
Not good. They both hated each other. They both wanted me.
Big, fat ego. And he sat there and said, I can't help it if 2 women love me. It's not my fault that 2 women love me. And I think it was an ego trip.
I think he knew exactly what he was doing throughout this whole case. It was just unfortunate for him that he was Stupid.
One thing that I'll never forget about this case is Ken Guess saying, when Sherry and Michael got married, I walked Sherry down the aisle and I left her there and gave my daughter to this man. And this was the man that killed my daughter. And that's something that I'll always remember him saying, and I'm sure it's something that he will never forget. Though the forensics in this case was very vital. The handwriting analysis on the checks that Diana Hahn wrote to purchase the items and the implements that she used to murder Sherry, that was key.
We hadn't found Sherry Daly's blood in the car that Diana Hahn had rented. I don't see how we would have solved the case.
An unknown assailant walked into a retail store and fired 3 shots, killing the owner. Police had suspects, but all had alibis. Forensic scientists found more than a crime perpetrated in broad daylight. Hidden in the shadows was a killer. Autumn is a particularly pretty time in Spring Grove, Pennsylvania. Landscape photographers and local artists usually found their way here to the Gray Fox Gallery. The owner, Jennifer Myers, was a well-known picture framer.
Just a wonderful woman, a wonderful mother, a wonderful wife, and a good friend to a lot of people.
Managing a retail shop isn't easy. 1 year earlier, Jennifer was robbed in the store at gunpoint. Since then, her husband Steve stopped in every afternoon on his way home from work at the local factory. Most afternoon visits were uneventful, but October 20th, 1997 was different.
Here, County 911. My wife's been shot.
Your wife's been shot?
Yeah, at Gray Fox Gallery in Spring Grove. Hurry.
Okay, sir, listen to me, okay? Do you know who shot her?
No, I don't.
Okay, where out on her body is she shot
In
at?
the face.
Okay, is she breathing? Sir, is she breathing?
No.
When police arrived, Jennifer was dead on the floor behind the counter. She had been shot 3 times. Several workers nearby said they heard popping noises a few hours earlier around 1 p.m. No one thought they were gunfire. Several witnesses saw a man with long black hair running from the shopping center sometime around 1 p.m.
This was someone that went in there with the sole intent to kill the victim. There was no struggle. A fight didn't precipitate this homicide. A robbery didn't precipitate this.
No money was missing from the cash register or Jennifer's purse.
When something like this happens, people feel as though their world has somewhat been changed and their sense of security is gone. Because if something like this can happen in Spring Grove, Pennsylvania, it can happen anywhere.
This brazen attack in a busy retail area at midday told police that the killer was willing to risk everything to kill Jennifer Myers.
It's somebody who definitely wanted her dead, that had a problem with her, and excluding robbery as being a motive, that's what you have to start looking at. Who wanted Jennifer Myers dead?
A ballistic examination identified the murder weapon as either a .357 or a .38 caliber revolver.
In Pennsylvania, there's a database as far as registered handguns. So we began to look at that, and we found that Stephen Myers did have a .357 that he owned.
Steve Myers willingly turned over the pistol for forensic analysis, but he didn't resemble the man seen running near the shop earlier in the day. Witnesses said they heard popping sounds which police suspected were gunfire near the Gray Fox picture frame shop around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Approximately 2 hours later, Steve Myers discovered his wife Jennifer shot to death on the floor of the store. Another witness saw a man running from the area wearing light blue jeans and a blue plaid flannel shirt.
We believe that the shooter came in the store, used a blitz-style attack on her, walking right towards her, firing the first shot and striking her in the shoulder area, and then firing a second shot, striking her in the abdomen. The last shot was to the face.
Ballistic experts examined the bullet fragments recovered from the victim and concluded the killer used a .38 or .357 caliber revolver. The victim's husband, Steve, owned a .357 revolver. When the bullets from the crime scene were compared to those test fired from Steve Myers' revolver, analysts concluded they were not a match. Police also confirmed that Steve Myers was at work when the murder took place.
He didn't need an alibi, but as far as him being at work, that just was one more piece that fit in that he was not involved in this killing whatsoever.
Police had another promising lead. Jennifer's murder took place just one day before she was scheduled to testify against 40-year-old Kevin Dowling, the man Jennifer claimed had robbed her at gunpoint a year earlier.
Okay, well now we have perhaps a motive for someone to want to have this woman dead so that she was incapable of testifying.
Kevin Dowling had the opportunity to commit the murder since he was free on bail that day. However, when questioned by police, Dowling said he had an alibi. He was fishing on a boat in Muddy Run Lake, a story confirmed by his wife.
Mrs. Dowling was very cooperative. She truly believed that her husband was not involved in this homicide whatsoever, and therefore was very helpful in proving her husband.
My girls were home, and after dinner, we all sat around and watched the tape with them together.
On the tape, Kevin spoke to his children about his impending robbery trial. He also expressed his hope that if convicted, the children would not misbehave while he was imprisoned.
But I gotta face what's ahead. I mean, I'm not responsible for what happened, but no one seems to want to help me, and I don't know what to do. My main concern is what's going to happen to Mommy and all you kids.
He's accounting for almost everything he did that day, which in itself began to strike me as kind of odd that he has these receipts, and the day seemed too perfect as far as use the word alibi.
Police wondered if Dowling had somehow doctored the videotape, and if he had, could forensic science prove it? Kevin Dowling insisted he did not kill Jennifer Myers, despite the fact that she was scheduled to testify against him in an upcoming robbery trial. Dowling also had an alibi, claiming he was fishing at the time of the murder, and he offered this time and date stamp videotape as evidence.
There's some big fish on his fish finder. Just wish I knew how to get him to hit.
The tape contains scenes shot from 10 in the morning until after 4 p.m. Jennifer's murder took place around 1 p.m. And her store was only 45 minutes away from the lake. Dowling's videotape gave him an airtight alibi. But police were still suspicious. Although Dowling shot scenes throughout the day, the entire running time of the tape was only 12 minutes.
He talked several times in the tape about catching fish, yet you never saw any fish on the tape, which again struck me odd that if you're catching fish, you'd want to show them on your videotape.
Something else about the tape bothered Mowry. Kevin Dowling repeatedly glanced at his wristwatch.
Which struck me kind of odd if he was on a casual day of fishing, why he was so concerned about the time of day.
In some parts of the tape, Dowling's watch faced the camera. Investigators isolated and enlarged clips of the watch. The timepiece was too blurry to read. Mowry asked scientists at the Federal Bureau of Investigation to try digital enhancement, but the tape quality was too poor for the process to work. Determining the time when Dowling shot the video was critical, since police were well aware that the time and date stamp can be manipulated.
The sun was out periodically throughout the tape and was casting very good shadowing. By determining shadowing positioning, can we work backwards and calculate the time of day using the sun, its position in the sky?
Detectives posed the question to NASA scientists at the Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland. Surprisingly, NASA identified a local astrophysicist to help them.
The guy that could probably do this was right in our own backyard, and that would be Dr. Robert Boyle at Dickinson College.
Being 90 degrees, south point being 180 degrees, the west point 270 degrees.
Boyle said he needed more than just the videotape to conduct a study. He needed specific scientific information.
He would need the measurements of the seven of the frames, and we used a degree of plus or minus 5 degrees as far as our degree of inaccuracy.
p.m.
Kevin Dowling now had the opportunity to commit this crime because he was not on Muddy Run Lake at 1 o'clock in the afternoon.
And he also had a motive. But prosecutors needed more than shadows on videotape to get a murder conviction. When police confronted Kevin Dowling with the scientific evidence that his time and date stamp videotape was a forgery, Dowling confessed, not to Jennifer Myers' murder, but to deception. He now said that after a few hours of fishing, he went to a nearby strip club and altered the times on the videotape so that his wife wouldn't find out.
I don't need to point out the strangeness of that theory. First of all, why did you videotape yourself at all? Why didn't you just say, I decided I didn't want to videotape myself? And of course, his wife would have never been the wiser.
And the videotape revealed something else. Dowling was wearing clothes similar to the man witnesses saw running from Jennifer Myers' store.
I did not want to believe that my husband, the father of my children, could do something like this to another human being.
Police found the clothes Dowling was wearing on the fishing trip in his home. They sent them to A.J. Skip Schwobel, an internationally recognized expert in forensic gunshot residue. When a pistol is fired, the firing pin ignites the elements in the projectile, which then turns into gas.
The gases solidify into tiny particles, which are then deposited on the hands, clothing, in the immediate proximity of the discharge.
To test clothing for gunshot residue, Schwobel first used an adhesive to extract any microscopic particles. The particles were placed in a scanning electron microscope, which subjected them to extreme magnification and provided an elemental analysis. An electron beam bombarded the sample, causing the elements within to emit characteristic X-rays.
The characteristic X-rays show up on the video screen as peaks or pulses at different energy levels. Each energy level is assigned an element.
Tests revealed gunshot residue on the left side of each of Kevin Dowling's garments. This was significant since Dowling was left-handed.
We found that every item had, to some extent, some gunshot residue present.
Prosecutors say Kevin Dowling carefully planned to eliminate Jennifer Myers to prevent her from testifying against him in his robbery trial. On the day of the murder, Dowling went fishing on Muddy Run Lake and used his video camera till 11:45.
A little ways off, we'll be back in a little while.
He then went ashore, hid the boat in some bushes, and made the 45-minute trip into town. Wearing a wig as a disguise, Dowling entered Jennifer's store around 1 p.m. and fired 3 shots. The gunpowder residue embedded deep into his shirt fibers, invisible to the naked eye, but perfectly clear to forensic scientists. Dowling was back in his boat on the lake sometime around 2 p.m. When he reset the time on his video camera to 11:24, he never realized that he was a human sundial. His videotape told the story of deceit, not innocence.
I would like to kick his ass. He has no remorse at all. And then you wonder how sick this man really is when he has no remorse over what he's done. And that is very scary.
Despite the forensic evidence, Kevin Dowling insisted he was innocent. But he was convicted of first-degree murder and was sentenced to death by lethal injection. His wife, Joanne, says she knew nothing of her husband's secret life and considers the death sentence too lenient.
I truly hate Kevin Dowling for everything he stands for, the person he is, what he did to people. I hate him more than I can even explain.
Well, you can't ever forget the infamous fishing tape, because how ridiculous is it to think that he would get away with something like that? I mean, there's technology today that's going to determine that this tape has been doctored.
It's one thing to have a motive to kill. It's another thing to actually prove that someone did it. And the forensics were able to give us the proof necessary.
Considering they never found the murder weapon. It's amazing what they can do nowadays. And without it, a lot of people would go free.
It's ironic, of course, we often talk about criminals hiding in the shadows, don't we? In this case, the shadows were actually revealed.
The photograph looked ordinary. A summer afternoon, bright Nebraska sunlight, a county fair crowded with families, children clutching balloons, farmers gathered beside livestock pens, teenagers laughing beneath colorful banners fluttering in the warm July wind. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. It was the kind of picture thousands of people tucked into family albums before eventually forgetting it inside dusty attic boxes. Yet nearly 30 years later, one detective would stare at that faded image under the harsh glow of an evidence lamp and realize it contained something no investigator had ever noticed. A single face, half hidden, standing exactly where no one should have been. And that forgotten photograph would reopen one of Nebraska's most haunting cold cases. Long before the discovery, before a laboratory compared enlarged negatives pixel by pixel, before prosecutors quietly assembled a case they never believed possible, the murder of 26-year-old Sarah Whitmore had become little more than another unsolved file buried inside the sheriff's archive. The people of Ash Creek remembered the headlines. Local teacher found dead. Small town shocked by brutal killing. No suspects. No witnesses. Then, as the years passed, the newspaper stopped printing updates. The television cameras disappeared. The detectives retired. Witnesses moved away. Children who had once whispered about the crime in school hallways became adults who barely remembered the victim's name. Only Sarah's family continued counting the years. Ash Creek was a kind of Nebraska town where everyone believed they knew everyone else. Fewer than 4,000 people lived there in 1987. The grain elevator stood taller than most buildings. Pickup trucks filled Main Street every Friday evening. Church bells echoed across the flat prairie every Sunday morning, and strangers were noticed almost immediately. It was a place where people rarely locked their doors, a place where murder felt impossible. Sarah Whitmore had grown up there. She taught 4th grade at the elementary school 2 blocks from the courthouse. Parents trusted her. Children adored her. She volunteered at the public library every Saturday and rarely missed the annual county fair. Friends describe her as dependable, patient, and endlessly optimistic. She wasn't known for taking risks. She followed routines. The same route home, the same grocery store, the same coffee shop every morning before work, which made her disappearance on the evening of August 18th, 1987, impossible to explain. She left school shortly after 5. Several teachers watched her walk toward her blue Ford sedan. A cashier later remembered selling her milk and bread at a neighborhood grocery store. At 6:42 p.m., a waitress at Miller's Diner served Sarah a cup of coffee. She smiled. She joked about grading papers late into the night. Nothing seemed unusual. That was the last confirmed sighting. When Sarah failed to appear for class the following morning, concern spread quickly. She had never missed work, never failed to call, never disappeared without telling someone where she was going. By noon, volunteers searched roads, cornfields, abandoned barns, and irrigation canals stretching for miles beyond town. At sunset, a deputy discovered her abandoned Ford parked beside an old gravel access road nearly 8 miles outside Ash Creek. The driver's door was closed. The keys were missing. Her purse remained on the passenger seat. Nothing appeared stolen. No obvious signs of violence surrounded the vehicle. Only tire tracks leading into the darkness before disappearing across dry prairie grass. The search expanded overnight. Helicopters circled the countryside. State investigators arrived before dawn. Reporters gathered outside the sheriff's office. Everyone expected Sarah to be found alive. Instead, less than 24 hours later, a rancher checking livestock discovered her body in a shallow drainage ditch hidden behind tall weeds nearly 2 miles from where her car had been abandoned. The news struck Ash Creek like lightning. Veteran deputies who had spent decades responding to accidents and domestic disputes stood speechless at the scene. Nothing about the crime made sense. There was no clear motive, no weapon left behind. Very little physical evidence survived the dry prairie wind that had swept across the area all night. Whoever had killed Sarah had left investigators with almost nothing. Almost, because tucked beneath one fingernail, crime scene technicians recovered a microscopic fragment of skin. In 1987, it meant almost nothing. DNA technology was still in its infancy. The sample was carefully preserved, labeled, sealed, and placed inside an evidence locker where it would remain untouched for decades. No one realized it would someday become the most valuable piece of evidence in the entire investigation. And no one, not the sheriff, not Sarah's grieving parents, not the exhausted detectives working around the clock, could have imagined that the key to identifying her killer wasn't hidden in the laboratory at all. It had already been captured, frozen forever, inside an ordinary photograph taken by a complete stranger at the county fair. The investigation exploded almost overnight. By the end of the week, every deputy in the county had been reassigned to the Whitmore case. Detectives from neighboring jurisdictions arrived carrying fresh notebooks and optimistic theories. Patrol officers knocked on hundreds of doors. Every resident who had spoken to Sarah during her final 48 hours was interviewed, then interviewed again. The questions never changed. Did she seem afraid? Was anyone following her? Did she argue with anyone recently? Had she mentioned meeting someone after work? Every answer sounded painfully ordinary. Sarah smiled. Sarah laughed. Sarah talked about lesson plans. Sarah planned to visit her parents that weekend. Nothing suggested she believed danger was waiting just beyond the edge of town. The autopsy deepened the mystery instead of solving it. The medical examiner estimated Sarah had died sometime between 7 and 9 o'clock that evening. There were defensive wounds on her hands, evidence that she had fought desperately against her attacker. Bruises suggested she had been restrained before the fatal injuries were inflicted. Yet there were no clear fingerprints, no discarded weapon, and no identifiable shoe impressions around the scene. The prairie had erased nearly everything. Detectives began building what they believed was a manageable suspect list. Former boyfriends, recently released offenders, travelers seen passing through Ash Creek, farm workers employed near the drainage ditch, truck drivers who had stopped for fuel that evening. More than 200 names were collected during the first month alone. Every lead demanded attention. Every possibility seemed plausible. None survived careful examination. Sarah's former fiancé had been attending a business conference nearly 200 miles away. Hotel records, receipts, and dozens of witnesses confirmed his whereabouts. A drifter spotted near the highway confessed after 3 days of questioning, only for investigators to discover he had been in another state when the murder occurred. An anonymous caller accused a respected local businessman. Detectives quietly investigated for weeks before proving the accusation completely false. One by one, promising leads collapsed. Frustration spread through the investigation. Captain Harold Bennett, who supervised the case, refused to accept defeat. "We're missing something," he repeated during every briefing. "The evidence is here. We just don't know how to read it." The problem was simple. Sarah lived an ordinary life. She had no known enemies, no large debts, no involvement with drugs, no connection to organized crime. Nothing investigators uncovered explained why anyone would target her. That absence of motive became the greatest obstacle. Without motive, every interview became speculation. Without witnesses, every theory remained incomplete. Then came the first strange development. 3 weeks after the murder, the sheriff's office received an anonymous letter. It contained only a single sentence typed on plain white paper. "You are looking in the wrong direction. No signature, no fingerprints, no return address. The envelope had been mailed from a neighboring county. Investigators hoped the writer possessed inside knowledge. Instead, they found nothing. The typewriter could not be identified. The paper was commercially available. The stamp revealed no useful evidence. The letter joined dozens of other unanswered questions inside the growing case file. Months passed. Public attention began fading. The television crews packed their equipment. National newspapers stopped calling. Ash Creek tried to return to normal, but normal no longer existed. Parents walked their children to school. Women refused to drive alone after sunset. Hardware stores sold every deadbolt they had in stock. For the first time in living memory, fear had settled over the town. Sarah's classroom remained empty until the school year ended. Students left handwritten notes on her desk. Some drew pictures. Others simply wrote, "We miss you." Teachers quietly removed them before summer break. No one had the heart to throw them away. By winter, the investigation had consumed thousands of hours, more than 600 interviews, hundreds of pieces of physical evidence, boxes filled with photographs, maps, handwritten statements, laboratory reports, and anonymous tips. Still no arrest. Captain Bennett gathered his investigators one final time before Christmas. The room was silent. Everyone looked exhausted. "We're not closing this case," Bennett said firmly. "We're preserving it." He ordered every document cataloged with extraordinary detail, every photograph labeled, every cassette interview duplicated, every evidence bag sealed again under stricter procedures than required by law. Some younger deputies questioned the effort. "If we're out of leads," one asked quietly, "why spend weeks organizing everything?" Bennett looked toward the evidence shelves. "Because someday," he answered, "someone will know something we don't." The room fell silent. No one realized how prophetic those words would become. The boxes disappeared into climate-controlled storage early in 1988. Years rolled into decades. Computers replaced filing cabinets. DNA science transformed criminal investigations across America. Detectives retired. Some passed away. Ash Creek expanded beyond its old railroad tracks. Children born after Sarah's murder grew into adults who recognized her name only from occasional newspaper anniversaries. The Whitmore file remained exactly where Bennett had ordered it placed. Waiting, patiently, dust gathered across the archive shelves. Evidence labels yellowed with age. Cassette tapes slowly deteriorated. Yet inside one carefully sealed envelope, protected from light, heat, and moisture, rested a tiny fragment recovered from beneath Sarah Whitmore's fingernail. No larger than a grain of rice. Ignored for years. Destined to change everything. Because in the spring of 2019, a retired detective named Daniel Cross walked back into the sheriff's office, carrying nothing except an old cardboard box, a notebook filled with unfinished questions, and a promise he had made more than 30 years earlier. He intended to solve the last case he had never been able to forget. Daniel Cross had officially retired 6 years earlier. He no longer carried a badge. No patrol. Radio crackled from his belt. The sheriff's office had cleaned out his desk, reassigned his parking space, and archived the investigations he had once believed would define his career. Yet one case had never truly left him: the Whitmore murder. Daniel had been only 29 years old when Sarah's body was discovered. Fresh out of the State Investigative Bureau, ambitious and relentless, he believed every crime could be solved if enough hours were invested. The Whitmore case shattered that belief. For nearly 5 years, he had chased every lead. He interviewed suspects until sunrise. He drove hundreds of miles following anonymous tips that ended in disappointment. He searched abandoned farmhouses, inspected forgotten wells, questioned prison inmates who claimed they knew the truth, and revisited the crime scene so often he could navigate the prairie in complete darkness. Nothing brought him closer. Eventually, newer murders demanded attention. Other victims needed justice. The Whitmore investigation slowly became another box on another shelf. Officially, unofficially, Daniel never stopped thinking about it. His wife noticed first. He would wake in the middle of the night after dreaming about evidence rooms. Sometimes she found him standing in the garage studying photocopies of old crime scene maps spread across the hood of his pickup. "You still think about her," she once said quietly. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Finally, he nodded. I think about what we missed. Years later, after retirement, he began organizing boxes stored in his basement. Among faded notebooks and worn case binders rested the original journal he had carried throughout the investigation. The pages were filled with hurried handwriting, names, addresses, questions, arrows connecting theories that no longer made sense. Near the final pages, he found something he had completely forgotten writing. One sentence circled 3 separate times. Never trust the obvious timeline. Daniel stared at those words for several minutes. He couldn't remember why he had written them. But younger detectives rarely circled something 3 times without believing it mattered. The next morning, he drove to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Emily Dawson recognized him immediately. "You missed the place?" she asked with a smile. Daniel shook his head. "I missed one file." Emily already knew which one. The Whitmore murder had become legendary inside Nebraska law enforcement. Every detective assigned to major crimes eventually studied it, not because it was the state's most notorious homicide, because it represented the investigation everyone believed should have been solved. Emily led Daniel into the climate-controlled archive. The evidence shelves looked almost identical to those he remembered decades earlier, except now every box carried digital inventory labels. She stopped beside shelf C14. There she is. 6 large evidence boxes, 34 binders, hundreds of photographs, more than 1,000 interview transcripts. Daniel rested his hand on the nearest carton. Dust no longer covered the file. Someone had cared enough to preserve it properly. He smiled. Captain Bennett would have approved. Emily folded her arms. "What are you looking for?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "A mistake." She laughed softly. "We've already reviewed the case 3 times. "I know. So what makes this review different?" Daniel opened the first binder. Experience. For the next several weeks, he worked quietly inside the archive. He ignored newspaper clippings, ignored public speculation, ignored theories that had grown popular over 3 decades. Instead, he focused only on original evidence, original interviews, original photographs. He wanted to see the investigation exactly as it existed in 1987, before memory reshaped it. Patterns began emerging almost immediately. Witness statements contained tiny inconsistencies. Several interview times had been recorded differently in separate reports. One deputy described Sarah's abandoned car facing east. Another photograph clearly showed it facing west. Minor discrepancies, easy to dismiss. Daniel refused to dismiss anything. Then he discovered something stranger. A witness named Linda Carver had insisted she saw Sarah leaving Miller's Diner alone at 6:45 p.m. Another witness, interviewed the same evening, claimed Sarah appeared to wave at someone waiting across the street. Investigators had accepted Linda's statement because she seemed more confident. The second witness eventually withdrew his account after doubting his own memory. Daniel read both interviews repeatedly. One detail bothered him. The second witness described the unknown person wearing a light-colored baseball cap. No detective ever followed that description. Why? He checked the interview dates. The answer surprised him. The statement had been buried beneath dozens of unrelated reports received during the investigation's busiest week. No one intentionally ignored it. It had simply disappeared beneath paperwork. Daniel leaned back in his chair. That alone wasn't enough to solve a murder, but it proved something important. The investigation wasn't flawless. If one observation had vanished inside the mountain of paperwork, how many others had suffered the same fate? He kept reading, hour after hour, day after day, slowly reconstructing the case from the beginning, until late one Friday afternoon, when he opened an evidence envelope labeled only County Fair Photographs, August 1987. Inside rested nearly 50 developed prints donated by local newspapers shortly after Sarah's death. Most had never been used. Children riding carnival attractions, prize-winning cattle, political speeches, families eating barbecue beneath striped tents, ordinary scenes from ordinary lives. Daniel almost returned them to the envelope. Then one photograph caught his eye. Sarah appeared in the background, barely visible, walking between two exhibition buildings. She wasn't alone. Someone was following her, not beside her, not speaking to her. Following, half concealed by the crowd, wearing a pale baseball cap. Daniel froze. For a long moment, he forgot to breathe. The photograph was only 5 inches wide. Its colors faded after more than 3 decades in storage. The image had been taken from the top of a Ferris wheel platform overlooking the fairgrounds. Hundreds of people filled the frame. Most appeared no larger than grains of rice. Sarah occupied less than half an inch of the photograph. The man behind her occupied even less. Under normal circumstances, no one would ever have noticed him. Daniel reached for a magnifying glass, then a stronger loop. Finally, he carried the print to the archive's digital scanning station. The computer slowly produced a high-resolution image. Pixels sharpened. Edges became clearer. The crowd separated into recognizable faces. Sarah walked toward the livestock pavilion, holding a paper cup in one hand. About 20 feet behind her stood a man in faded blue jeans, a light-colored baseball cap, and a dark denim jacket, despite the summer heat. His face remained partially hidden, not because he turned away, because someone else walked directly between him and the camera at the exact moment the shutter clicked. Daniel enlarged the image again. The stranger's eyes remained visible. They weren't looking toward the Ferris wheel. They weren't watching the crowd. They were fixed on Sarah. Every instinct Daniel had developed over 35 years of investigative work came alive. This wasn't casual coincidence. This wasn't simply another visitor walking in the same direction. The man's posture told a different story. His shoulders leaned slightly forward. His stride matched Sarah's pace. The distance between them remained deliberate, close enough to watch, far enough not to attract attention. Daniel immediately searched the remaining photographs. 49 images, then 50, then back again. Nothing. The man appeared only once. One frame, less than a second captured forever. Yet it was enough to change the entire investigation. Daniel hurried to Sheriff Emily Dawson's office. She studied in large print in silence. After several minutes, she finally looked up. "You think he followed her?" "I think we've been looking at the wrong timeline for 32 years. Emily frowned. "Explain." Daniel placed the original witness statements beside the photograph. Sarah attended the county fair 3 days before she was murdered. Emily nodded. "We've always known that. We assumed it had nothing to do with the case." Daniel tapped the photograph. What if it was a beginning? The room fell silent. Until that moment, investigators had treated the murder as an isolated event occurring on the evening Sarah disappeared. Daniel proposed something completely different. Someone may have been watching her days earlier, learning her routine, studying where she parked, who she spoke with, what time she left work. The murder might not have been spontaneous. It might have been planned. Emily immediately reopened every report connected to the county fair. Parking attendants, food vendors, carnival employees, deputies assigned to crowd control. More than 300 names resurfaced from archived records. Many had died. Others had moved across the country. Tracking them would take months. Daniel welcomed the challenge. Real investigations, he often said, begin where paperwork ends. Forensic technicians digitally restored the photograph using modern imaging software unavailable in 1987. Every enhancement revealed another tiny detail. The man's denim jacket carried a stitched emblem above the left pocket, too blurred to read. His baseball cap displayed a dark rectangular patch, again unreadable. Then one technician noticed something unexpected, a reflection. Sarah's paper cup had a shiny plastic lid. Barely visible inside the reflection appeared part of the man's face from another angle. Tiny, distorted, almost impossible to recognize, but enough to reconstruct. The laboratory spent nearly 2 weeks enhancing the microscopic reflection. When the process finished, Daniel stared at the monitor in disbelief. The face remained incomplete. One cheek, part of a nose, half an eye. Still, it was more facial detail than investigators had possessed in 32 years. The image was submitted to facial comparison specialists. No immediate match appeared. Daniel wasn't discouraged. He had learned long ago that breakthroughs rarely arrived fully formed. They arrived one fragment at a time. While analysts worked, he returned to the witness interviews. This time he ignored every statement mentioning Sarah. Instead, he searched for descriptions of strangers. One teenager remembered a man asking unusual questions about local teachers. A volunteer recalled someone spending hours near the school fundraising booth without participating in any activities. A carnival worker vaguely remembered a customer wearing a denim jacket who returned repeatedly without riding attractions. None of these observations seemed important individually. Together, they formed something investigators had never recognized before. The same man might have spent the entire weekend moving quietly around the fairgrounds, watching, waiting, learning. Then another forgotten document surfaced, a parking ticket, issued during the fair. The handwritten note caught Daniel's attention. Vehicle observed circling, employee parking area multiple times. Driver left before identification. No license plate, no driver's name, only one description, older blue pickup. Daniel closed the file. He looked once more at the enlarged photograph pinned to the evidence board. For decades, the Whitmore case had appeared impossible because detectives searched for someone connected directly to Sarah. Perhaps they had been asking the wrong question. Perhaps the killer hadn't known Sarah personally at all. Perhaps he had chosen her, studied her, followed her, and somewhere, hidden inside another forgotten box, another overlooked photograph, or another witness statement buried beneath thousands of pages, waited the final detail that would transform a blurred stranger into a name. For the first time in more than 3 decades, the Whitmore investigation was no longer standing still. It was moving, slowly, patiently, toward a face that had been hiding in plain sight since the summer of 1987. Daniel refused to celebrate. 35 years of investigative work had taught him a painful lesson. A promising lead was not the same as proof. The photograph had reopened the case. It had not solved it. Early the next morning, he pinned an enlarged image at the center of a fresh evidence board. Everything else came down. Old suspect lists, discarded theories, maps covered with faded pushpins, anonymous letters that had consumed weeks of investigation decades earlier. Daniel wanted the case to begin again. From zero, he wrote one sentence across the top of the board. Who was the man in the cap? Nothing else mattered until that question had an answer. The sheriff assembled a small cold case task force. Unlike the original investigation, this team wasn't racing against time. They weren't chasing fresh footprints or preserving a fragile crime scene. They were chasing history. Every surviving witness from the 1987 county fair was contacted again. Some interviews took place in nursing homes. Others happened over video calls from different states. Many witnesses apologized before speaking. I'm not sure I remember correctly. Daniel always replied with the same words. You don't have to remember everything. Just remember one thing. Sometimes one thing was enough. A retired ticket seller remembered a man repeatedly purchasing admission on consecutive days instead of buying the cheaper weekend pass. He kept leaving, she said. Then he'd come back a few hours later. Did he seem nervous? No, he seemed busy. Another witness remembered the same man studying bulletin boards near the livestock pavilion, not reading advertisements, reading volunteer schedules. A former high school student suddenly recalled something no one had asked about in 1987. He carried a camera. Daniel looked up immediately. What kind? I don't know. But he wasn't taking pictures. What do you mean? He always held a camera. I almost never saw him use it. The room became silent. A camera, an excuse to stand still, an excuse to watch people without attracting attention, an excuse to follow someone while appearing completely harmless. Daniel wrote 3 words across his notebook. Camera was camouflage. The theory changed everything. Investigators reviewed every fair photograph once again, not searching for Sarah, searching for cameras. Within days, they identified the same man in 2 additional images. Both times a camera hung around his neck. Both times the lens pointed toward the ground. He wasn't photographing the fair. He was watching people, The images were still frustratingly unclear, yet together they established something critical. The stranger had remained at the fair for hours, always alone, always moving, always observing. Then the laboratory called. A forensic imaging specialist had enhanced the embroidered patch on the stranger's denim jacket. The letters remained incomplete. Only 4 were readable. Rain. Daniel examined the enlargement repeatedly. Could it be a company logo? A town name? A farming cooperative? Hundreds of possibilities existed. Then one technician noticed another detail. The stitching formed part of an oval, not a rectangle. Daniel immediately requested historical records of Nebraska businesses, trucking companies, feed suppliers, and agricultural equipment manufacturers using logos ending in those letters. The search returned hundreds of results. Most were eliminated within hours. One remained: Prairie Grain Transport, a regional trucking company operating throughout Nebraska during the 1980s. Its employee jackets featured a blue oval patch. The final visible letters matched perfectly. Daniel leaned forward. Give me every employment record they still have. The company had closed nearly 20 years earlier. Finding the files would not be easy. Boxes had been transferred between bankruptcy trustees, storage facilities, and county warehouses. Weeks passed. Finally, investigators located payroll records preserved inside a commercial archive. Hundreds of names: drivers, mechanics, dispatchers, warehouse workers. Daniel compared every employee photograph against the reconstructed face from the county fair. Most could be dismissed immediately. Too old, too young, wrong build, wrong facial structure. Until one personnel file stopped him cold. Employee number 417. Michael Harlan, hired in 1984. Long-haul truck driver. Known routes included western Nebraska, Dot, and Ash Creek. Daniel slowly lifted the faded identification photograph. The image had been taken in 1985. Michael Harlan wore a light-colored baseball cap. The resemblance wasn't perfect. Time, poor image quality, and partial facial visibility prevented certainty. But the jawline, the eyes, the shape of the nose, close enough that no experienced detective could ignore it. Emily entered the room carrying fresh coffee. She noticed Daniel's expression immediately. You found someone. I found a possibility. She studied both photographs side by side. After several seconds, she whispered, My God. Daniel didn't answer. He continued reading. Harlan had resigned from Prairie Grain Transport less than 6 months after Sarah's murder. No forwarding address. No explanation. Employment file closed. The timing sent a chill through the room. Still, suspicion was not evidence. Resemblance was not identification. And after 32 years, memories alone would never convince a jury. Daniel carefully returned the personnel file to the table. He looked toward the sealed evidence envelope containing the tiny skin fragment recovered beneath Sarah Whitmore's fingernail. The DNA. For decades it had waited, silent, untouched. Now, for the first time, investigators finally had a real name to compare it against. If Michael Harlan was the man in the photograph, if Michael Harlan had followed Sarah through the county fair, if Michael Harlan had encountered her again on the night she disappeared, then somewhere hidden inside that microscopic fragment preserved since August 1987, the truth had been waiting all along. The evidence envelope looked almost insignificant. It was no larger than an ordinary business envelope, its edges worn from decades of careful handling. The original seal from 1987 remained intact beneath 2 newer evidence seals added over the years. Across the front, faded handwriting identified its contents in blue ink. Trace biological material recovered from victim. Daniel stared at it longer than anyone else in the room. He remembered watching the crime scene technician seal it 32 years earlier. Back then, DNA was little more than an experimental promise. Detectives relied on fingerprints, eyewitnesses, tire impressions, and luck. Nobody in that room had believed the tiny fragment beneath Sarah Whitmore's fingernail would someday become the center of the investigation. Yet here it was, waiting, Emily contacted the state forensic laboratory immediately. Within hours, the evidence was transported under strict chain of custody procedures. No shortcuts, no assumptions. If this case was finally going to reach a courtroom, every step had to withstand relentless scrutiny. Daniel remained behind. He wasn't interested in waiting helplessly for laboratory results. He wanted to understand Michael Harlan before science spoke. The employment file revealed only the surface. Date of birth, commercial driver's license, payroll history, emergency contact listed as an older sister in Kansas. No criminal convictions, no disciplinary actions. On paper, Michael Harlan appeared almost invisible. Too invisible. Daniel requested every public record investigators could legally obtain: property records, vehicle registrations, marriage licenses, traffic citations, military service, tax documents. The picture slowly emerged. Harlan had spent most of the 1980s driving grain routes across Nebraska, Iowa, and South Dakota. His schedule frequently placed him within 50 miles of Ash Creek. He lived alone, moved frequently, never remained at one address longer than 18 months. No wife, no children, very few close relatives. The pattern troubled Daniel. People who constantly disappear often become difficult to trace, sometimes intentionally. Then another coincidence surfaced. One fuel receipt preserved by Prairie Grain Transport showed Harlan purchasing diesel less than 10 miles from Ash Creek on August 18, 1987, the day Sarah died. Daniel closed his eyes. Coincidences were beginning to pile together. The fair photographs, the baseball cap, the company jacket, the truck route, the fuel receipt. Individually, each explained little. Together, they formed a direction. Still not proof, but enough to justify digging deeper. Investigators located Harlan's surviving sister living outside Wichita. She was 78 years old. The interview began gently. "When did you last see your brother?" She hesitated. "Maybe 20 years. "You weren't close." "He never stayed anywhere very long." She described Michael as quiet, restless, the type of man who could sit through an entire family dinner without speaking more than 5 sentences. Then she mentioned something unexpected. He always carried cameras. Daniel immediately looked up. "Cameras?" She nodded. "Old film cameras." "Did he enjoy photography?" A long silence followed. "No." "Then why carry them?" She shrugged. "I never saw him develop a single roll of film." The room became very still. Another witness. Another camera. Exactly the same observation made by the teenager from the county fair. Daniel asked to see family photographs. Most showed ordinary birthdays and Christmas gatherings. Then one picture froze the room. Taken in 1986. Michael stood beside his pickup truck. He wore the same pale baseball cap, the same denim work jacket, and hanging from his neck, the same camera. Daniel felt a chill run through him. He placed a family photograph beside the enhanced county fair image. Different years, different locations. The similarities were unmistakable. The laboratory still needed to confirm identity scientifically, but the investigation had finally found something it had lacked for more than 3 decades: consistency. That afternoon, another call arrived. The forensic laboratory wasn't reporting DNA results. Not yet. Instead, analysts had discovered something unexpected while re-examining Sarah's clothing with modern technology. Tiny blue cotton fibers had remained embedded inside the fabric. Fibers too microscopic for meaningful comparison in 1987. Today they could be analyzed. The color, the weave, the manufacturing pattern. Everything pointed toward heavy-duty workwear. Specifically, industrial denim jackets produced during the mid-1980s. Exactly the style issued by Prairie Grain Transport. Daniel leaned back slowly. He had seen investigations collapse because detectives fell in love with a theory. He refused to make that mistake. Every new piece of evidence had to challenge the theory, not support it. So he asked the question nobody else wanted to ask. What proofs were wrong? The room fell silent. Emily finally answered. The DNA, Daniel nodded. If it excludes Harlan, he looked toward the evidence board. We start over. No one argued. 3 days later, the laboratory director called personally. Her voice remained calm, professional, but Daniel immediately recognized something had changed. The comparison is complete, she said. He gripped the phone tighter. And there was a brief pause. Then came the sentence he had waited 32 years to hear. We have a match. Daniel closed his eyes, not out of relief, out of disbelief. The microscopic skin fragment preserved beneath Sarah Whitmore's fingernail matched the DNA profile obtained from Michael Harlan's surviving biological records with extraordinarily high statistical certainty. Science had finally spoken. The unknown man in the old photograph now had a name, and the cold case that had haunted Nebraska for more than 3 decades had just taken its first undeniable step toward the truth. The room remained silent after the laboratory director ended the call. No one celebrated. Not yet. Daniel slowly placed the phone back into its cradle and looked across the conference table. Every investigator understood the significance of the DNA match, but they also understood its limitations. Michael Harlan had died, a heart attack, 6 years earlier. He would never sit across an interrogation table. He would never answer a single question. He would never explain why Sarah Whitmore died. Justice had finally found its suspect, but the truth was still incomplete. Daniel stood and walked toward the evidence board. For more than 3 decades, Sarah's photograph had occupied the center. Now beside it, investigators pinned another picture. Michael Harlan, the unknown man from the county fair, finally had a name. Emily broke the silence. What now? Daniel answered without taking his eyes off the board. Now we prove exactly what happened. The investigation entered an entirely different phase. No longer searching for a suspect, searching for a reconstruction. Every mile Harlan had traveled during August 1987 became important. Archived trucking logs were recovered from microfilm. Fuel receipts were digitized. Weight station records were examined. Delivery schedules were reconstructed day by day. Slowly, an extraordinary timeline emerged. Harlan had entered Ash Creek 4 separate times during the week before Sarah disappeared. The official delivery required only 1 visit. 3 others had no documented business purpose. He simply returned. Again and again, Daniel highlighted every appearance on a large map. The pattern became obvious. Each visit coincided with Sarah's routine. One afternoon near the elementary school, another close to the grocery store, another during the county fair. Then finally, August 18th, the day of the murder, investigators requested archive bank records. One small withdrawal caught their attention. At 5:58 p.m., Harlan purchased gasoline less than 2 miles from Miller's Diner. Sarah was drinking coffee inside the diner at exactly that time. Daniel placed the receipt beside Sarah's known timeline. The overlap was impossible to ignore. Harlan had been there, close enough to see her, close enough to follow. Then came another discovery. A retired mechanic contacted the sheriff's office after hearing news reports that the cold case had been reopened. I think I remember that truck. Daniel visited him the following morning. The mechanic was 83 years old. His memory occasionally wandered, but one detail remained crystal clear. There was mud. What kind of mud? Gray clay. Daniel frowned. There isn't gray clay around Ash Creek. The mechanic smiled. I know. That's why I remembered. The old man explained that Harlan stopped at his repair garage the morning after Sarah disappeared. Not because the truck was damaged, because he wanted it washed immediately, including the undercarriage. He insisted. He even paid extra. Daniel's pulse quickened. The drainage ditch where Sarah's body had been discovered sat on an isolated stretch of land containing unusually dense gray clay, unlike the surrounding prairie soil. Back in 1987, investigators never connected the garage visit to murder. No one even knew it had happened. The mechanic had repaired thousands of trucks over the decades. Only after seeing Harlan's face on television did the memory return. The team searched storage warehouses for surviving service invoices. Against extraordinary odds, they found one, faded, water-stained, barely readable. Date, August 19, 1987. Vehicle, Prairie Grain Transport Unit 214. Customer, Michael Harlan. Requested service. Complete exterior and undercarriage wash. Daniel stared at the invoice. One more coincidence. Except the investigation had reached a point where coincidence no longer seemed believable. Still, one question haunted him. Why Sarah? Nothing in Harlan's history suggested he knew her personally. No letters, no phone calls, no shared acquaintances, nothing. Emily proposed the most unsettling theory of the entire investigation. What if she wasn't chosen because she was Sarah Whitmore? Daniel looked toward her. What do you mean? What if she was chosen because she was available? The room fell silent. Random. The possibility horrified everyone. A predator studying routines, watching strangers, waiting for opportunity instead of revenge. It explained everything investigators had struggled to understand in 1987. No obvious motive, no personal conflict, no warning signs. Sarah hadn't been targeted because of who she was. She had simply crossed paths with the wrong man. Behavioral analysts reviewed Harlan's reconstructive movements. Their conclusions were chilling. The repeated visits, the surveillance at the fair, the apparent use of a camera as camouflage, the unexplained returns to Ash Creek. Everything pointed toward organized predatory behavior. The county fair hadn't introduced Harlan to Sarah. It had given him an opportunity to observe her unnoticed. By the time August 18th arrived, he already knew her routine. Daniel returned once more to the original photograph, the one taken from the Ferris wheel. For years, investigators believed it was merely another fair picture. Now, they saw something entirely different. The beginning of the crime. Not legally, emotionally. That single frame captured the moment a predator selected his victim. The photograph hadn't recorded a murder. It had recorded the decision that eventually led to one. Weeks later, the Whitmore family gathered privately inside the sheriff's office. Sarah's younger brother, now older than Sarah had ever lived to become, sat quietly beside Daniel. He looked at the evidence board for a very long time. Finally he spoke. So, he swallowed hard. You found him. Daniel nodded. We believe we did. The man looked again at Sarah's smiling photograph. I always thought the hardest part would be hearing his name. He paused. It isn't. What is? He closed his eyes briefly, realizing he was standing in front of people all along. His voice almost disappeared. And nobody knew what they were looking at. Daniel didn't answer, because there was nothing to add. For 32 years, the truth had existed inside a faded photograph stored in an evidence envelope, not hidden, not destroyed. Simply, unnoticed. The official announcement was scheduled for a Thursday morning. No dramatic press conference had been planned. No triumphant speeches. Sheriff Emily Dawson insisted that the focus remain where it had belonged since August of 1987, not on the killer, on Sarah Whitmore. By 9 o'clock, reporters filled the briefing room. Some had covered the original investigation as young journalists. Others had not even been born when the murder occurred. Television cameras lined the back wall. Microphones covered the podium. Daniel stood quietly near the rear of the room. He had declined every request to speak publicly. He hadn't reopened the investigation for recognition. He had reopened it because he had made a promise to himself more than 3 decades earlier. Emily stepped to the podium. Behind her, a single photograph of Sarah rested on an easel. Not the crime scene photograph. Not the evidence board. A family portrait. Sarah smiling. Alive. Exactly as those who loved her wanted the world to remember. Emily began calmly. 37 years ago, 26-year-old Sarah Whitmore was murdered outside Ash Creek, Nebraska. Despite one of the largest investigations in county history, the case remained unsolved for decades. The room was silent. She continued. Advances in forensic DNA analysis, combined with a comprehensive review of original evidence, including archival photographs overlooked during the initial investigation, have allowed investigators to identify the individual responsible. Reporters immediately began writing. Cameras clicked continuously. Emily spoke the name, Michael Robert Harlan. No one interrupted. She carefully explained the evidence, the preserved DNA, the reconstructed timeline, the historical employment records, the county fair photographs, the newly discovered service invoice placing Harlan's truck under urgent cleaning the morning after the crime. Each fact supported the next, piece by piece. The investigation no longer relied on speculation. It relied on science. One reporter raised a hand. Why wasn't this solved in 1987? Emily answered without hesitation. Because the technology did not exist. Another question followed. What about the old photograph? Emily looked briefly toward Daniel before answering. The photograph was always there. She paused. We simply didn't yet know what we were seeing. Those words echoed across the room. They summarized 37 years of frustration more accurately than any investigative report ever could. News spread rapidly across Nebraska. Headlines appeared within hours. 1987 cold case solved after DNA match. Old photograph helps identify killer decades later. Retired detective finishes final investigation. Ash Creek reacted quietly. People visited the small cemetery where Sarah rested. Flowers appeared without explanation. Former students, now middle-aged adults, shared memories of a teacher who had encouraged them to read, write, and believe in themselves. Many admitted they had stopped expecting answers long ago. Now the answers had arrived. Too late to change history, but not too late to tell the truth. Several weeks after the announcement, Daniel returned alone to the county fairgrounds. The Ferris wheel was gone. Modern attractions occupied different locations. The livestock buildings had been renovated. Nothing looked exactly the same. Yet he found the approximate place where the unknown photographer had stood in August of 1987. He looked across the grounds. Families laughed. Children ran between food stands. Teenagers carried oversized stuffed animals won from carnival games. Life continued, exactly as it should. Daniel removed a carefully protected copy of the famous photograph from his jacket. He studied it one final time. Sarah walking through the crowd. Michael Harlan following silently behind. None realizing they had become witnesses to the opening moments of a tragedy. He slipped the photograph back into his protective sleeve. Not as evidence anymore. As history. Months later, the original evidence boxes were returned to the archive. For the first time since 1987, the Whitmore case file received a new classification stamp. Daniel watched quietly as the clerk pressed the red ink onto the cover. Solved. One word. 6 letters. It had taken 37 years to earn them. Daniel rested his hand gently on the box before it disappeared onto the shelf. He remembered Captain Harold Bennett's final instruction all those years ago. We're not closing this case. We're preserving it. Only now did Daniel fully understand why. Bennett hadn't been preserving paperwork. He had been preserving possibility. Because he believed that one day someone would know something the original investigators could not. He had been right. As sunset settled over the Nebraska prairie, Daniel drove away from the sheriff's office for what he knew would be the final time. The road stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Golden fields swayed beneath the evening wind. The same landscape that had guarded its secrets for nearly 4 decades now seemed strangely peaceful. He wasn't thinking about Michael Harlan. History would remember the killer only as a name inside a court file that never reached trial. Instead, Daniel thought about Sarah, a young teacher whose life had ended far too soon, a family that had refused to stop believing, a microscopic fragment of DNA that survived the passage of time, and one ordinary photograph taken by a stranger who could never have imagined that a single press of the shutter would one day solve a murder. Some people believe justice arrives with flashing lights, dramatic confessions, or courtroom verdicts. Sometimes it does. But sometimes justice waits quietly inside a forgotten evidence box, hidden in plain sight, until science catches up a memory, and finally allows the dead to tell the story they were never able to finish themselves. Years passed after the announcement. The headlines disappeared almost as quickly as they had arrived. Television crews left Ash Creek. national reporters moved on to newer tragedies. The story that had once dominated front pages slowly settled into the quiet rhythm of local history. But inside the Whitmore home, something had changed forever. For 37 years, every anniversary had begun with the same question. Who did it? Now that question was gone. In its place remained another. Why? It was a question no laboratory could answer. No detective could prove motive with certainty. Michael Harlan had died without leaving a confession, a diary, or a recorded statement. Investigators searched every storage unit he had rented, every address where he had lived, every surviving personal belonging recovered from relatives. Boxes of old receipts, truck maintenance manuals, maps folded in side glove compartments, dozens of undeveloped rolls of 35mm film. The film immediately caught Daniel's attention. Most had been sitting untouched for decades. Some were damaged beyond recovery. Others could still be developed using modern restoration techniques. Weeks later, technicians carefully processed the surviving negatives. The photographs revealed lonely highways stretching across Nebraska, truck stops, grain silos, county fairs, parking lots, schools, public parks. Nothing illegal, nothing directly connected to Sarah. Yet something disturbed the analysts. Many photographs weren't photographs at all. People occupied the center of the frame. Women reading books on park benches. Teachers leaving school buildings. Cashiers closing grocery stores. Young mothers walking with children. Most never looked toward the camera. None appeared aware they were being photographed. Daniel stared at the contact sheets spread across the laboratory table. This wasn't photography. One analyst nodded. It was surveillance. The room fell silent. No one spoke for nearly a minute. The realization changed the understanding of Michael Harlan forever. Sarah Whitmore had not been unique. She had been one of many strangers he quietly observed through a camera lens. Most of those observations ended harmlessly. One did not. Investigators contacted agencies in neighboring states. Could Harlan be connected to other unsolved crimes? Cases were reviewed. DNA evidence compared where possible. Timelines reconstructed. Nothing definitive emerged. Some similarities existed. No scientific evidence established additional victims. Daniel refused to speculate publicly. One solved case built on evidence was worth more than 10 theories built on fear. Still, the developed film offered one final lesson. Predators often hide behind ordinary behavior. A man carrying a camera. A truck driver stopping for fuel. A stranger blending into a crowd. Nothing about Michael Harlan had appeared remarkable in 1987. That anonymity had been his greatest disguise. Months later, the restored county fair photograph was placed inside a climate-controlled display at the Nebraska State Criminal Investigation Museum. The exhibit was simple. No dramatic lighting. No sensational language. Only the photograph. Beside it, a short inscription. For 37 years, the answer remained in plain sight. Advances in forensic science and careful review of preserved evidence finally revealed what earlier investigators could not see. Visitors often spent several minutes studying the image. Many asked the same question. Which one is the suspect? Museum staff usually smiled before pointing toward the enlarged reproduction beside the original. Most visitors looked surprised. I never would have noticed him. Exactly. That was the point. Real investigations are rarely solved because someone suddenly discovers spectacular evidence. More often, someone learns to see ordinary evidence differently. Late one autumn afternoon, Daniel visited the museum alone. He watched families moving slowly through the exhibit. Teenagers leaned close to examine the photograph. Retired police officers read every caption. An elderly woman quietly wiped tears from her eyes after reading Sarah's story. Daniel remained unnoticed in the background, just another visitor, exactly as he preferred. A young boy tugged gently on his father's sleeve. Dad. What? Why didn't they see him before? His father considered the question carefully. I think. He looked again at the faded photograph. Because sometimes the truth isn't hidden. It's just waiting for someone to recognize it. Daniel smiled. He couldn't have answered better himself. As he left the museum, The evening sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. He paused beside his truck. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, he felt no urge to return to the evidence room. No unfinished notes waited on his desk. No unanswered questions kept him awake at night. Sarah Whitmore's file was finally complete, not because every mystery had been solved, but because the most important one had. The name, the face, the truth. Somewhere inside the archives of the sheriff's office, 6 weathered evidence boxes rested quietly on their shelf beneath a single red stamp. Solved. The ink would eventually fade. The cardboard would continue aging. Technology would keep advancing. Future detectives would solve crimes using methods unimaginable today. But every young investigator who opened the Whitmore file would learn the same lesson Daniel Cross carried for the rest of his life. Never underestimate the evidence that everyone else has already stopped looking at, because sometimes the smallest clue, a microscopic fragment beneath a victim's fingernail, a faded receipt, or a forgotten photograph taken on an ordinary summer afternoon, can wait patiently for decades before finally speaking loud enough to change history forever. The Whitmore investigation soon became required reading for every new detective entering the Nebraska State Criminal Investigation Academy. Not because it was the state's oldest cold case. Not because DNA had identified the killer. Those things had happened before. The case became legendary because it demonstrated something every investigator needed to remember. Evidence does not become less truthful simply because it becomes older. On the first day of cold case training, recruits enter a classroom where a single enlarged photograph hung on the wall. The county fair. Summer. No labios. No explanation. The instructor gave them one instruction. Tell me what you see. The answers were predictable. A Ferris wheel. Families. Livestock. Food stands. A teacher walking through the crowd. No one noticed the man. Not immediately. 20 minutes later, the instructor circled the tiny figure wearing the pale baseball cap. The room always became silent. It was the same silence Daniel had experienced years earlier inside the archive. Then came the lesson. The evidence never changed. Only the people looking at it did. Those words stayed with every young investigator who left the academy. Daniel rarely spoke publicly after the case was closed. When universities invited him to lecture, he usually declined. When documentary producers requested interviews, he politely refused. Only once did he agree. Not because he wanted attention, because the audience consisted of families still waiting for answers in their own unsolved cases. He walked onto the stage carrying no notes, no slides, only the original photocopy of the county fair photograph. He held it up. For 32 years, he began quietly, I believe this photograph contained nothing useful. The room listened without moving. I was wrong. He looked across the audience. The mistake wasn't made by one detective. It was made by time. People leaned forward. Daniel continued. Time convinces us that old evidence has already told us everything it knows. He shook his head gently. It hasn't. Sometimes evidence is simply waiting for better questions. When the lecture ended, dozens of families approached him. Most carried photographs of missing loved ones. Others brought folders filled with newspaper clippings decades old. One elderly father quietly handed Daniel a faded picture of his missing daughter. I know you can't reopen every case. Daniel looked at the photograph. No, but someone should keep asking questions. The man smiled sadly. That's all I've ever wanted. Back in Ash Creek, Sarah Whitmore's former classroom had long since been renovated. New paint covered the walls. Modern computers replaced chalkboards. Generations of children had learned there, without realizing the room once belonged to a young teacher whose kindness was still remembered by grandparents throughout the town. On the first day of every school year, the principal quietly told new teachers about Sarah. Not the details of her murder, the details of her life. How she stayed after school, helping struggling readers. How she bought winter coats for students whose families couldn't afford them. How she believed every child deserved to feel seen. That's how we honor her, the principal would say. Not by remembering how she died, by remembering how she lived. One spring afternoon, Daniel received a small package in the mail. No return address. Inside rested a newly printed copy of the famous county fair photograph. Across the bottom, someone had written by hand, "Thank you for looking one more time." Nothing else. No signature. Daniel framed it, not as a trophy, as a reminder. Every morning it hung above the desk where he now spent his retirement reading history books instead of case files. Sometimes visitors noticed it. "Is that the photograph?" Daniel nodded. They usually asked the same question. "How did you finally see him?" Daniel always smiled before answering. "I didn't." They looked confused. He continued, "I stopped looking for photographs to prove what I already believed. I started asking what the photograph wanted to tell me. That difference, he believed, solved the case." On the 40th anniversary of Sarah Whitmore's murder, the town of Ash Creek gathered quietly in the community park. No television cameras attended. No reporters. Only neighbors, former students, friends, families. The mayor unveiled a simple bronze plaque. It did not mention Michael Harlan. His name appeared nowhere. Instead, the inscription read, "In memory of Sarah Whitmore, beloved teacher, whose compassion shaped generations of children, may truth never stop seeking those who can no longer speak for themselves." Flowers slowly surrounded the memorial throughout the afternoon. Children who had never heard of the case asked their parents who Sarah had been. Parents answered with stories, not about violence, about kindness, about patience, about a teacher who believed every child mattered. As the ceremony ended, Daniel remained standing near the edge of the crowd. The prairie wind moved gently through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the Nebraska fields. Life continued, exactly as Sarah would have wanted. He looked once more toward the memorial before walking back to his truck. The Whitmore case had begun with fear, uncertainty, and decades of unanswered questions. It ended not with revenge, but with truth. A truth preserved by investigators who refused to throw away evidence they couldn't yet understand. A truth unlocked by science decades after the crime itself. And a truth revealed because one retired detective chose to open an old evidence box one more time, believing that even after 37 years, the past might still have one final story left to tell. Daniel often wondered what would have happened if Captain Harold Bennett had made a different decision in the winter of 1987. It would have been easy. The investigation had exhausted every available lead. Budgets were shrinking. Storage space was limited. Evidence standards were different. No one would question the destruction of worn notebooks, duplicate photographs, or boxes filled with seemingly insignificant paperwork. Across the country, countless agencies had done exactly that. Instead, Bennett had insisted on preserving everything, every negative, every interview, every handwritten map, every receipt, every envelope. At the time, younger detectives believed he was simply unwilling to admit defeat. Only decades later did they understand. He wasn't preserving the past. He was protecting the future, because he knew future investigators would possess tools his generation could never imagine. He simply didn't know what those tools would be. That single decision became the invisible hero of the Whitmore investigation. Without preserved DNA, no match. Without preserved photographs, no suspect. Without preserved witness interviews, no reconstructed timeline. Without preserved receipts, no corroboration. The case had not been solved by one extraordinary clue. It had been solved because hundreds of ordinary clues survived long enough to finally connect. Several months after the investigation officially closed, the Nebraska Sheriff's Association invited Daniel to address a conference attended by investigators from across the Midwest. Unlike previous invitations, he accepted not to discuss Michael Harlan, not to explain forensic genetics. He wanted to speak about something much simpler, memory. Standing before nearly 400 detectives, Daniel placed 3 objects on the podium: a faded photograph, an old evidence envelope, a worn investigator's notebook. He pointed toward the notebook first. "This contains my mistakes." The audience exchanged curious glances. "I wrote theories inside it. Many were wrong." He picked up the evidence envelope. "This contains science." It never cared whether my theories were right. Finally, he lifted the photograph. And this, he smiled quietly, contains a question. He paused long enough for the room to become completely silent. The job of a detective isn't proving your first theory. It's asking better questions until the evidence answers for itself. Many officers later said those words stayed with them longer than any lecture on forensic technology. The Whitmore file eventually became one of the most requested training cases in Nebraska. Every copy included a final page written years after the investigation ended, not by a prosecutor, not by a laboratory scientist, by Daniel. The page contained no technical analysis, no legal conclusions, only 5 short sentences. Protect every piece of evidence. Document everything. Assume future investigators will know more than you do. Never confuse an old case with a hopeless case. Truth has no expiration date. Those 5 sentences became known among young detectives simply as the Whitmore Principles. One rainy afternoon, Daniel received a letter from a rookie investigator in another state. The young detective described reopening a 28-year-old homicide after reading the Whitmore case. Buried inside forgotten evidence boxes, his team discovered fingerprints that modern technology successfully identified. An arrest followed weeks later. The letter ended with one sentence. Your case reminded us that time destroys memories faster than evidence. Daniel folded the letter carefully. He placed it inside the same drawer that held the famous county fair photograph. Another story, another reminder, another life changed because someone refused to stop looking. Years later, after Daniel himself was gone, visitors continued walking to the Nebraska Criminal Investigation Museum. Children still stopped before the enlarged county fair photograph. Parents still leaned closer, trying to identify the man in the pale baseball cap before reading the explanation beside it. Most couldn't. They almost always reacted the same way. He was right there. Yes, he had always been right there, hidden not by darkness, not by distance, but by ordinary human attention. The photograph became more than evidence. It became a lesson. Every generation believes it sees the world clearly. History repeatedly proves otherwise. Sometimes the most important detail occupies only a tiny corner of the picture, waiting, patiently, for someone willing to look again. Today, the original Whitmore evidence boxes remain preserved inside the county archive. Their cardboard edges are older. The ink has faded. The tape has yellowed. Yet the red stamp across the front remains unmistakable. Solved. Visitors occasionally ask archivists why the boxes are still kept after the investigation ended. The answer is always the same. Because this isn't just a murder case anymore. It's a reminder that justice sometimes moves slower than anyone believes possible. A reminder that science keeps advancing long after detectives retire. A reminder that forgotten photographs, overlooked witnesses, microscopic traces, and patient investigators can outlast decades of silence. And above all, a reminder that somewhere, inside an evidence room in a town no one has ever heard of, another forgotten box may already contain the answer to a mystery that has not yet been solved. Waiting for the day someone opens it, asks one new question, and discovers that the truth had been there all along. The Whitmore investigation officially ended with a signed case report spanning more than 300 pages. It documented every interview, every forensic finding, every recovered record, and every scientific conclusion that transformed a decades-old mystery into a solved homicide. Yet the final page contained no dramatic language, no declaration of victory, only a simple sentence written beneath the closing summary. Justice delayed is not justice denied when the truth is finally preserved. Daniel read that sentence several times before signing his name beneath it. Then he quietly closed the file. He knew it would be the last homicide report he would ever complete. Several weeks later, the county archive received an unexpected donation. The family of the anonymous photographer who had taken the famous county fair picture contacted the sheriff's office. While cleaning out an attic after his death, they discovered several boxes marked Ash Creek County Fair, 1987. Inside were hundreds of undeveloped negatives, contact sheets, and handwritten notes documenting the event. No one had realized they still existed. The collection was carefully examined. Most of the photographs showed ordinary scenes. Children winning ribbons, farmers displaying livestock, local musicians performing on a temporary stage. But investigators hoped there might be one more glimpse of Michael Harlan, one more angle, one more frame. Technicians spent nearly 2 months scanning every negative. Thousands of images passed across computer screens. Most revealed nothing connected to the case. Then, on an overcast Tuesday afternoon, a restoration specialist paused. Daniel. He walked over. What is it? The technician enlarged a newly scanned frame. It had been taken only seconds before the now famous photograph. Sarah was not yet visible. Instead, Michael Harlan stood alone beside an information board. His camera hung around his neck. He appeared to be studying a map of the fairgrounds. The resolution was dramatically better. His face was unobstructed. For the first time, investigators possessed a clear image of him during the days leading up to Sarah's murder. Daniel compared it with the employment identification photograph. There was no doubt. The same man. The newly discovered image changed nothing legally. The DNA had already established his identity. But emotionally, it closed the final gap. The stranger hidden inside the crowd no longer remained anonymous. History finally had a face to match the evidence. The museum eventually added the second photograph to its exhibit. Visitors could now see the investigation unfold visually. The first image showed an ordinary man blending into a crowd. The second showed investigators finally recognizing who he had always been. The display ended with one sentence illuminated beneath both photographs. Sometimes evidence waits patiently for technology. Sometimes it waits for perspective. On a quiet autumn morning, Sarah Whitmore's former students gathered for what would have been her 65th birthday. Many had not seen one another in decades. Some traveled across the country, simply to attend. One after another, they shared memories, not of the investigation, not of newspaper headlines, but of a teacher who stayed after class to help struggling readers, who attended school plays, who remembered birthdays without writing them down. One man, now a physician, smiled as he stepped forward. I became a doctor because Mrs. Whitmore once told me I could become anything if I kept asking questions. The audience laughed softly. Then he looked toward Daniel. I suppose she inspired you too. Daniel smiled. She probably did. As the gathering ended, Sarah's brother approached Daniel once more. He had aged noticeably since the investigation reopened. Gray hair now framed a face that had carried grief for nearly 4 decades. He extended his hand. I've been trying to think of the right words. Daniel shook his head gently. You don't owe me anything. I know. The older man looked toward his sister's memorial. But I owe you one sentence. He paused. For 37 years, my family wondered if the world had forgotten Sarah. He smiled through tears. Now I know it never did. Daniel couldn't answer. Some moments require silence more than words. Driving home that evening, he took the long route across the Nebraska prairie. Golden fields stretched endlessly beneath the setting sun. Wind moved through the tall grass exactly as it had on that August evening in 1987. Nature remembered nothing. People remembered everything. Daniel stopped beside an empty gravel road overlooking the open landscape. He stepped from the truck. The air carried the scent of harvested corn and distant rain. Somewhere far away, a freight train echoed across the plains. He closed his eyes. 37 years earlier, he had stood on nearly this same stretch of land believing the case might never be solved. Now the uncertainty was gone. Not every question had an answer. Perhaps it never would. But the most important promise had been kept. Sarah Whitmore no longer rested beneath the label unknown killer. History had corrected itself. Justice, though painfully late, had finally arrived. Daniel climbed back into his truck and drove toward the fading horizon. Behind him, the prairie grew quiet once more. Ahead lay only open road. The investigation that had defined his life was finally over. But its greatest lesson would continue traveling far beyond Nebraska, reminding generations of investigators that no evidence is ever truly silent. Sometimes It is simply waiting for someone who refuses to stop listening. The Whitmore case eventually found its place in criminal justice textbooks across the country, not as a sensational murder, not as a story about an elusive killer, but as one of the clearest demonstrations of how patience, evidence preservation, and advancing forensic science can converge decades after a crime. Law students studied the legal standards required to reopen a dormant investigation. Forensic scientists analyzed the DNA procedures that transformed a microscopic skin fragment into conclusive identification. Young detectives focused on something else entirely: the photograph. In classroom after classroom, instructors projected the faded county fair image onto large screens. Before revealing the answer, they asked every student the same question: what are you looking at? The exercise rarely lasted more than a few minutes. Most students described the obvious: food stands, families, livestock exhibits, children, Ferris wheel. Only after careful prompting did someone finally notice the man standing behind Sarah. That delay became the lesson itself. The evidence had never been invisible. Human attention had simply been directed elsewhere. Investigators learned that solving old cases often required abandoning assumptions that had quietly hardened into facts. The Whitmore investigation proved that certainty can become as dangerous as ignorance. Years after Daniel's retirement, Sheriff Emily Dawson was invited to speak at a national conference devoted entirely to cold cases. She brought only one visual aid: the famous photograph. Standing before hundreds of investigators, she said something that surprised the audience. The breakthrough wasn't DNA. Several people looked puzzled. Emily continued. DNA identified the suspect. The breakthrough happened earlier. She pointed toward the photograph. The breakthrough occurred the moment someone decided this evidence deserved one more look. Silence filled the conference hall. We often talk about new technology solving old crimes. She smiled gently. But technology cannot ask questions. People do. Those words spread through law enforcement publications over the following months. Many agencies began reviewing archived evidence using fresh investigative teams specifically chosen because they had never worked the original cases. Fresh eyes, fresh questions, fresh possibilities. Ash Creek slowly embraced a future no longer overshadowed by uncertainty. For decades, newcomers had associated the town with an unsolved murder. Now, they associated it with something very different: persistence. The local historical society created an exhibit honoring not only Sarah Whitmore, but also the investigators who refused to allow the evidence to disappear. Captain Harold Bennett's careful preservation policies. Daniel Cross's relentless review. Modern forensic scientists who transformed impossible evidence into undeniable proof. The exhibit avoided sensationalism. It focused instead on responsibility. A single display case contained 3 objects: the original evidence envelope, a copy of the county fair photograph, Daniel's worn investigative notebook. A plaque beneath them read, "Justice belongs not only to those who search, but also to those who preserve." Visitors often stood before that display longer than any other. One winter evening, long after the museum had closed, the curator completed a routine inspection of the galleries. Before switching off the lights, she paused in front of the Whitmore exhibit. She looked once more at the enlarged photograph. Even knowing exactly where Michael Harlan stood, she still found herself searching the crowd. That always fascinated her. The human, I wanted to look everywhere except the right place. She smiled quietly, then turned off the lights. Darkness settled over the museum. Only the emergency exit signs continued glowing softly. Inside the silent gallery, the photograph remained exactly where it had always been. Unchanged, patient, still teaching anyone willing to look closely enough. In the years that followed, several other cold cases across the Midwest were reopened using techniques inspired by the Whitmore investigation. Some were solved. Others remained mysteries. Daniel never claimed every forgotten case could reach the same ending. He knew reality too well for that. Evidence disappears. Witnesses die. Memories fade. Sometimes the truth is lost forever. But he also understood something equally important. The only cases guaranteed to remain unsolved are the ones no one is willing to reopen. That belief became his final legacy. On what would have been Sarah Whitmore's 70th birthday, children from Ash Creek Elementary planted a row of maple trees along the edge of the school grounds. The principal gathered them beneath the morning sun. "These trees are here for a teacher," she explained. "A teacher who believed every student could make the world a little better." The children placed small shovels into the earth. Most knew very little about Sarah's story. That was intentional. They learned about kindness before tragedy, hope before violence, character before crime. As the final tree was planted, the wind moved gently across the open Nebraska fields. Its branches swayed, almost silently. Years from now, those trees would grow tall enough to shade new generations of students. Most would never know the full story behind them. But every spring, as green leaves returned after another long winter, they would stand as quiet reminders that some lives continue shaping the future long after they are gone. And somewhere, preserved inside an evidence archive, an ordinary photograph would continue reminding investigators across the country that history often whispers instead of shouts. The truth rarely disappears. Sometimes it simply waits for better science, for fresh perspective, and for one determined person willing to ask the question everyone else stopped asking decades before. Nearly 50 years after Sarah Whitmore's death, a group of graduate students from a university forensic science program traveled to Ash Creek as part of a research project on historic investigations. Most of them knew the Whitmore case only from textbooks. To them, it was an example, a chapter, a successful application of forensic genealogy, DNA preservation, and evidence review. What they did not understand, at least not until they arrived, was the human cost hidden behind every page of the file. The sheriff's archive had agreed to display selected materials for educational purposes. Nothing graphic, nothing sensational, just enough to illustrate how an investigation evolves across decades. The students gathered around a long wooden table where carefully protected evidence boxes rested beneath clear archival covers. Each box carried dates written by hand. One student quietly asked the archivist, "How many people worked this case?" The archivist smiled. "We stopped counting years ago." Another student looked toward the faded labels. "So many detectives, so many scientists, so many witnesses." The archivist nodded, and none of them solved it alone. That answer lingered in the room. Modern crime stories often celebrated a single brilliant detective. Reality almost never worked that way. The Whitmore investigation belonged to generations. The deputy who preserved evidence, the technician who labeled it correctly, the laboratory that protected the DNA, the retired detective who reopened the boxes, the analyst who enhanced an overlooked photograph. Each contribution seemed small at the time. Together, they became justice. One student remained behind after the tour ended. She stared quietly at the enlarged county fair photograph. "I've seen this image dozens of times," she admitted. "But today I noticed something different." The archivist walked over. "What did you notice?" She pointed toward the people surrounding Sarah. They were all living ordinary lives. She paused. They had no idea history was happening around them. The archivist smiled softly. "Neither do we." Those 4 words captured something no investigative report ever could. History is almost never recognized while it's unfolding. It becomes history only after ordinary moments refuse to stay ordinary. That evening, the students returned to their university carrying notebooks full of technical observations, DNA preservation, digital image enhancement, evidence chain of custody procedures. But the lesson most of them remembered had nothing to do with science. It came from a sentence written by Daniel Cross years earlier inside the final appendix of the Whitmore file. Every piece of evidence deserved the chance to become important. The sentence appeared simple, almost obvious, yet it challenged decades of investigative habit. Evidence is rarely identified as significant the moment it is collected. Its value often emerges only after future discoveries reshape old assumptions. The Whitmore case proved exactly that. Long after Daniel's passing, his office remained almost untouched by his family. Shelves still held history books, investigative manuals, and binders filled with handwritten notes from long-forgotten cases. Above the desk hung the framed copy of the county fair photograph. Visitors occasionally asked why he had displayed that picture instead of the newspaper announcing the case had finally been solved. His daughter always answered the same way. Because Dad said the photograph represented curiosity, the newspaper only represented the ending. Outside, the Nebraska prairie continued changing with the seasons. Spring rains, summer heat, autumn harvests, winter snow stretching across empty fields. Nature moved forward without remembering names. People carried the memories instead. Sarah Whitmore's students became grandparents. Young detectives became veteran investigators. Technology advanced beyond anything imaginable in 1987. Artificial intelligence assisted image reconstruction. DNA sequencing became faster and more precise. Cold case units expanded throughout the country. Yet inside training academies, instructors still began the Whitmore lesson with exactly the same photograph. Not because newer technology had replaced good detective work, because it had confirmed it. Technology provided answers. Curiosity provided the questions. Without both, the truth would have remained buried forever. Today, if you walk the quiet streets of Ash Creek, nothing immediately reveals that one of Nebraska's most remarkable cold case investigations unfolded there. Children ride bicycles along sidewalks. Farm trucks roll through Main Street before sunrise. Church bells still echo across the prairie every Sunday morning. Life continues, exactly as Sarah herself would have wanted. The headlines have faded. The television cameras are long gone. The evidence boxes rest quietly inside their archive. The photograph remains protected behind museum glass. And somewhere between memory and history, one simple lesson continues to outlive every investigator who helped solve the case. Justice is not measured by how quickly it arrives. It is measured by whether people continue searching after everyone else believes there is nothing left to find. Because sometimes the smallest forgotten detail, a faded photograph, a preserved DNA sample, a handwritten receipt, or a detective unwilling to let go, can wait silently through decades of dust and silence before finally revealing the truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. The final box was sealed on a quiet Friday afternoon, not because new evidence had been discovered, not because another suspect had emerged, simply because every document generated by the renewed investigation had finally been cataloged, indexed, and preserved for the future. An archivist carefully placed the last report inside an acid-free folder, attached the identification label, and closed the lid. The sound was almost inaudible, a simple click. Yet that tiny sound marked the end of the journey that had stretched across nearly 4 decades. For a long moment, no one in the archive spoke. The shelves surrounding them contained thousands of other investigations, some solved, many still waiting. Each box represented a family hoping that one day another detective might decide to look again. The Whitmore case no longer belonged among the unsolved. It belonged among the cases that reminded investigators why they never stopped preserving evidence. Years later, a young detective beginning his first assignment in the county cold case unit wandered through the archive, searching for a completely unrelated file. As he passed shelf C-14, an older evidence custodian noticed him looking at the familiar red stamp. Solved. You know that case? The custodian asked. The young detective nodded. Everyone knows it. The older man smiled. No, everyone knows the ending. He gently tapped the weathered evidence box. Very few people understand the years before the ending. The detective paused. What do you mean? The custodian looked across the endless rows of archive files. People remember breakthroughs. They forget patience. He pointed toward hundreds of other boxes. Every one of those investigations is waiting for someone patient enough to ask a new question. The young detective stood silently for several seconds before continuing toward his own assignment. He would remember that conversation for the rest of his career. The Whitmore investigation eventually influenced more than police work. Universities teaching forensic science used it to demonstrate why evidence preservation standards matter. Archivists cited it when arguing against destroying historical criminal records. Prosecutors referenced it when discussing the reliability of modern DNA analysis in decades-old homicides. Even photographers occasionally discuss the famous county fair image, not because of its artistic value, because it proves something extraordinary. A single ordinary photograph, captured without any knowledge of the future, had unknowingly preserved the first visual link between a victim and her killer. No one behind the camera intended to solve a murder. History simply chose that moment to leave behind a clue. One documentary filmmaker, after spending months researching the investigation, asked a question that had never appeared in any official report. What if the photographer had stood 10 feet farther to the left? Daniel, interviewed shortly before his death, smiled thoughtfully. Then we probably never would have seen him. The filmmaker nodded. So the case depended on chance? Daniel shook his head. No, it depended on preparation. Seeing the filmmaker's confusion, he explained. Chance created the photograph. Preparation allowed someone to recognize its importance. That distinction became one of the documentary's most quoted lines. Luck may create opportunities. Only persistence turns them into answers. Every August, without public announcement or ceremony, fresh flowers continued appearing at Sarah Whitmore's grave. No one knew exactly who left them. Some believed former students. Others guessed retired teachers. A few thought perhaps investigators still visited quietly. The cemetery caretaker stopped trying to solve that mystery years earlier. He simply replaced the water whenever the flowers appeared. Some question, he decided, did not need answers. As another summer settled across the Nebraska prairie, sunlight once again washed over county fairgrounds filled with laughter, music, and families. Children ran beneath colorful banners. Teenagers crowded around carnival games. Parents carried paper cups of lemonade through the afternoon heat. Life unfolded almost exactly as it had decades before. Thousands of photographs were taken that weekend. Most would spend years inside albums, phone galleries, or forgotten storage boxes. Perhaps all of them would remain ordinary forever. Or perhaps one image, unnoticed among thousands, had already captured a detail that someday, years or even decades later, would become the missing piece of another unanswered mystery. No one could know. That is the quiet power of history. It often records the truth long before anyone understands what they are looking at. And that is why the Whitmore case continues to endure, not merely as a story of a cold case solved, but as a reminder that every investigation is ultimately a conversation between the past and the future. The past leaves behind fragments. The future learns how to read them. Between those two moments stands a detective willing to open one more forgotten box, examine one more faded photograph, and believe that even after decades of silence, the evidence may still have one final truth waiting to be heard.